fall of Rome. It's the phrase we've all heard, tucked neatly into the beginning of every textbook, as if history could truly hinge on a single moment. A crumbling empire, barbarian invasions, marble statues toppled under dust. That's the image we're given. A world collapsing in flames, chaos spreading like wildfire across Europe, civilization turning to ash. But when you look closer, there was no great explosion, no decisive war, no apocalypse. What followed Rome's fall wasn't fire, it was silence. A silence so vast, so complete, it still echoes across the centuries. Because what came next wasn't the madness of disorder, but the mystery of disappearance. An entire civilization didn't just break apart, it vanished almost politely. As if someone had drawn the curtain across the stage and the audience simply forgot to clap. The roads still stood, the aqueducts still flowed. People still lived in the shadows of great temples and libraries. But the flame that once burned, curiosity, invention, wonder, it dimmed. Not suddenly, not with a scream, but with a breath held far too long. And that's where the true mystery begins, because empires fall. They always do. But knowledge doesn't crumble, it spreads. It's copied, traded, whispered across borders. Unless someone stops it. Unless someone seals it. And that's exactly what seems to have happened. From the moment Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476, the timeline fractures. Letters grow rare, chronicles grow vague, innovation halts, cities that once pulsed with art and mathematics begin to sleepwalk through time. For centuries, no inventions, no great thinkers, no explorers venturing beyond the horizon. Europe didn't fall into darkness, it was placed there. Think about that. In the same centuries when Chinese scholars were inventing paper currency and perfecting astronomy, when Islamic scientists were cataloguing the stars and developing medicine, Europe forgot how to build a roof. The question is no longer why did Rome fall? The real question is, why did the light go out? Because darkness isn't just the absence of light. Sometimes it's a choice, a system, a silence loud enough to drown generations. Historians call this era the Dark Ages. But perhaps that's the wrong name entirely, because when you peer into that void, really peer, you don't find chaos, you find stillness. As if time itself had been paused, as if someone, somewhere, wanted it that way. Tonight, we don't revisit the fall of Rome to watch stones tumble. We go searching through the silence that followed, not to ask what happened, but to ask who allowed it to happen, who needed it to happen, and what they didn't want us to remember. So let your thoughts drift, let the noise fade, let the edges of accepted history blur, because somewhere, deep within the folds of forgotten time, the truth may still be waiting, quiet, patient, and very much awake. The term itself arrives like a whisper from a forgotten mouth, the Dark Ages. It sounds ominous, heavy, as if the skies themselves turned black and knowledge simply surrendered. But here's the strange thing. No one called it that at the time. The people living through those centuries didn't walk their muddy roads and think, we are living in darkness. That name was given later, much later. By whom? And for what purpose? It wasn't until the 14th century that the phrase saeculum obscurum, the age of darkness, appeared in scholarly texts. It was not a historical term, it was a judgment, a verdict passed by men who came after, men who wanted to separate themselves from the past and stand in the light by casting shadows backward. The Renaissance thinkers, the humanists, the early architects of modern Europe, they painted the 1,000 years between Rome's fall and their own flowering as a time of ignorance, superstition and stagnation, a void between two peaks. But was that really the case? Or was it the story they needed to tell, to make their own story shine brighter? Because if you wish to appear as the bringer of light, you must first convince the world it's been lost in the dark. The truth is more complicated. Beneath that foggy label of dark ages lies 1,000 years of real lives, of small advancements, quiet brilliance, and forgotten resistance, of scholars working by candlelight, of midwives passing down secret knowledge, of poets etching ideas into fragile parchment, but much of it erased, deliberately. And when you look at who was controlling the script of history during that millennium, the picture becomes clearer. Monasteries became the new libraries, monks, the gatekeepers of the written word, the church, the sole editor of what was worth remembering and what was not. Entire texts vanished, not in flames, but through neglect, or censorship, or slow deliberate omission. Histories rewritten not with lies, but with gaps, centuries blurred together, rulers forgotten, philosophies labelled as heresy, progress hidden behind veils of piety, and slowly, almost elegantly, the world forgot what it once knew, and that forgetting became a kind of design. Because in darkness, control is easier. In darkness, truth becomes malleable. In darkness, the past can be shaped to serve the present. So when we say Dark Ages, we're not just repeating an old term, we're echoing the design of those who needed history to vanish, to be quiet, to be convenient. Maybe the darkness was never about ignorance at all. Maybe it was about power, the power to decide what gets remembered and what must be forgotten. Let that settle for a moment, because once you understand that the darkness might have been crafted, not caused, you start to wonder. How much of history was not simply lost, but hidden, and if it was hidden, who, even now, holds the key? It didn't disappear with a bang. There was no grand funeral for the knowledge of the ancient world, no ceremony, no silence thick with grief. It simply stopped being spoken. One day, the scrolls were being read aloud in marble courtyards. The next, they were gone, replaced by scripture, or sealed behind wooden doors. The last breath of knowledge. Imagine that moment. A physician trained in Galen's medicine watches his students vanish, called away by fear or faith. An architect sketching arches inspired by Alexandria is told his designs are heretical. A stargazer, eyes lifted to the night sky, suddenly forced to turn them downward, because the stars no longer belonged to man. They belonged to heaven, and only the church could interpret their meaning. This wasn't a chaotic collapse. It was something colder, more methodical. The slow turning of a lock. One by one the lights dimmed, not extinguished but deliberately shuttered. Take mathematics. The Greeks had given the world the foundation. Euclid, Archimedes, Pythagoras. Their theorems whispered the language of the universe. Their scrolls travelled across trade routes, copied by hands from Egypt to India. But in Europe, those symbols stopped appearing. Equations were no longer taught. Numbers became dangerous, because numbers lead to patterns, and patterns lead to questions, and questions to doubt. Astronomy met the same fate. The skies had once been a library of divine logic. Babylonian stargazers, Persian observatories, Roman astrologers, all reading the heavens like a clock made of stars. But suddenly, the night became sacred territory. To chart the cosmos was to trespass on God's domain. The punishment? Silence. Those who did continue to chart the stars were branded sorcerers, or worse, heretics. And then there was medicine. The ancients knew of surgeries, of antiseptics, of the humours and the pulse. Hippocrates had once taught that illness had cause and cure. But now, sickness was divine punishment. Cures were replaced with prayers, science was replaced with miracles, and healers became threats to the order. So where did all that wisdom go? Was it truly lost, or was it hidden? Some believe it was carefully locked away in monasteries, only accessible to those deemed worthy. Others say it travelled, through the East, through Islamic scholars who preserved, studied, and expanded it. But in the West, the silence grew louder and louder, until entire generations forgot what their ancestors had once known. This is the tragedy of the so-called Dark Ages. Not the absence of light, but the refusal to see it. A deliberate blinding, not of the eyes, but of the mind. And somewhere, in a cold stone room, a candle may have flickered still, a scroll preserved, a secret whispered between monks. But for the world outside, that breath of knowledge had already exhaled, and no one was allowed to breathe it in again, not yet. The image is always the same, flames licking ancient scrolls, the sky blackened with smoke, knowledge consumed in a single night of destruction. We picture Alexandria, the great library burning, the wisdom of centuries, lost in fire. But fire is dramatic, fire is memorable. And real control doesn't need drama. Real control prefers something quieter, something colder, something that leaves no smoke, only silence. Because while some libraries did burn, most did not. They were emptied, reorganized, purged, and then forgotten. Across the crumbling Roman Empire, as cities fell and rulers changed, something subtle unfolded in the shadows. Scrolls were gathered, codices lifted from forgotten shelves, books wrapped in cloth and carted away, not by looters but by men in robes, monks, scriptoriums, orders of quiet obedience, not to destroy but to possess. They were told they were saving the wisdom of the ancients, preserving it, protecting it from the chaos outside. And in some cases, they were. But preservation is not access, because once those texts disappeared into monasteries, they did not return. Not to the cities, not to the scholars, not to the world. They became part of a new system, a system where only the chosen few could read, interpret, and decide what truths should survive, and which should not. In this way, the libraries of old were burned in spirit, if not in flame. Knowledge didn't vanish, it was made unreachable. Take the scrolls of Lucretius, or the mathematical works of Hypatia, gone from public memory, not because they were destroyed, but because they were hidden, locked behind stone walls, translated only in part, if at all. Some were rewritten, reframed to fit a new narrative. The sacred replaced the logical, the divine replaced the empirical, and over time the silence did its work. When a book isn't read, it dies, not all at once, but slowly. Its meaning fades, its language twists, its context is lost. And eventually, even its existence is doubted. That's the power of silence. Not the loud crash of destruction, but the gentle hum of forgetting. And so, the old libraries, those temples of learning that once stood at the heart of ancient cities, became ghosts. Their names whispered, their contents speculated, but their pages sealed. Meanwhile, the church built its own libraries, its own archives, its own definition of truth. It did not need to erase everything, only enough to make the past unknowable, enough to control what came next. And if the light of knowledge still flickered somewhere, it did so under heavy watch, surrounded by prayers, locked behind Latin and buried under layers of ritual. Fire is easy to blame. It leaves ruins. It creates martyrs. But the more powerful weapon was silence. Rome didn't vanish in a day, it unravelled, not in fire but in forgetfulness. As emperors fell and the army fractured, as aqueducts dried and libraries emptied, a strange vacuum opened, not just of power, but of meaning. People no longer knew who ruled them, but more importantly, they no longer knew who they were. And that's when the church stepped forward, not with swords, not with legions, but with scripture, with silence, and with an open hand, offering certainty in a world suddenly unsure. In the beginning, the church was nothing more than a persecuted fringe, huddled beneath Roman law. Its followers whispered their faith behind locked doors. But when the empire cracked, those whispers became echoes, and those echoes filled the void, because nature abhors a vacuum, and history, even more so. So while palaces crumbled, basilicas rose. While senators disappeared, bishops emerged, and while temples were looted, altars were built on their stones. Rome fell, but something older, something more durable, remained. A system, an institution, a belief that could shape not only the soul, but the story. Because once the empire's voice went quiet, only one voice remained. And that voice belonged to the church. It didn't just offer salvation, it offered memory. It told the people what had been, it told them what mattered. And slowly, it told them what didn't. The scribes became monks, the courts became cathedrals, and the forum became the pulpit. But memory, when filtered through doctrine, does not stay pure. It bends, it adapts, it learns to serve, and so did history. The church didn't rewrite all of it. It didn't have to. It preserved what supported the narrative, and what didn't was left behind. Scrolls were copied, selectively. Timelines were altered, quietly. Philosophies were reinterpreted or condemned. This wasn't just preservation, it was curation. Imagine holding a book and deciding which chapters to copy and which to skip, then passing that copy on for the next 1,000 years. Eventually, no one remembers the missing chapters even existed. That is how memory is rewritten. That is how history is reborn, not in truth, but in usefulness. And with every passing century, the church's version of the past became the only version, the only light left in the dark. The monks who wrote in candlelit scriptoria weren't just preserving sacred texts. They were building a new foundation, one carefully laid atop the ruins of the old world. And as the stones of Rome sank into the earth, the papal crown rose above them. By the 10th century, there was no Rome, only the Holy Roman Church, and no Caesar. Only the Vicar of Christ. The empire that once ruled by law and steel was replaced by one that ruled by belief. And belief, once rooted deep enough, can outlast any stone. So when we say that the church rose from the ashes of Rome, we must understand it did not inherit the ruins. It inherited the story, and with it the right to decide what the world would remember, and what it never would. Words are power, not just for what they say, but for who can understand them. As the Roman Empire collapsed, Latin was everywhere. It was the language of the law, of commerce, of poets and politicians. It was spoken in markets, inscribed on monuments, etched into the heartbeat of daily life. But then, it changed, slowly, deliberately. Classical Latin, fluid, poetic, accessible, gave way to something colder, ecclesiastical Latin. Not a language of the people, a language of control. It was never meant to be spoken in the streets. It was meant to be preserved behind stone walls, echoed only in cathedrals, whispered through stained glass and incense. And only the initiated could understand it. Only the clergy. Only the chosen. In time, a gap opened between the written word and the spoken world. The peasants of Europe no longer heard sermons in a tongue they knew. They bowed their heads to prayers they couldn't comprehend. They signed confessions they couldn't read. And over generations, the ability to read at all disappeared. And not because people grew ignorant, but because they were made ignorant, deliberately. Because when you make knowledge unreadable, you make it untouchable. and untouchable knowledge is no different from lost knowledge. The Bible, once translated freely in Greek and Aramaic, was sealed behind Latin ink. No translations were allowed. To translate it was heresy. To read it without permission, a crime. Imagine that. Imagine a world where truth exists, but only in a language you're not allowed to learn. That's not education, that's a fortress, and Latin became the wall. Behind it, the church safeguarded theology, science, philosophy, and history, but not for the people, for itself. The scribes copied texts, but they copied them in a language only the clergy could interpret, and slowly the rest of the world forgot what they once knew. The words still existed, but their meaning drifted out of reach. It's a brilliant kind of censorship, one without fire, one without destruction. You don't have to burn a book to erase it, you just need to make sure no one can read it. And so, Europe fell quiet, not in body, but in voice, in mind, in memory. The marketplace no longer echoed with argument. The schools closed their doors. The old Roman libraries crumbled into dust. And through it all, Latin remained, but not as a bridge between minds, as a gate, one only the ordained could pass, a gate that would stay closed for centuries. Until one day, someone dared to translate the Bible, and everything changed. But that's another chapter. For now, understand this. When a language becomes sacred, it stops being shared. And the moment that happens, knowledge doesn't disappear. It's taken and locked, and only the few are given the key. Time feels fixed, stable, like a river flowing from the past to the present in one continuous, unbroken line. But what if that river has bends we've never seen? What if some of its waters were diverted, and some of it never flowed at all? There is a theory, a quiet one, whispered at the edges of mainstream history. It's called the phantom time hypothesis, and it suggests something radical, that nearly 300 years of human history, from roughly 614 to 911 AD, simply never happened. Not misrecorded, not misunderstood, invented. The idea was first introduced in the 1990s by German historian Heribert Illig. He noticed strange gaps in architecture, in cultural development, in the very calendar itself. According to Illig, our timeline was artificially stretched, centuries added, events inserted, kings fabricated, and if true, that would mean we're not living in the 21st century, but somewhere in the 18th. But why? Why create time that never existed? And more importantly, who would have the power to do so? Three names are often whispered: Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, and Pope Sylvester II. Men of influence, men of ambition. Together it's theorized they rewrote the calendar to align Otto's rule with the year 1000, a date heavy with religious and symbolic meaning, a date that would legitimize his reign as divinely ordained. But adjusting the timeline wasn't as simple as changing the date. It required backfilling history, inserting rulers, creating battles, crafting documents, and most of all, making sure no one noticed. So how could this have been pulled off? Look at who controlled the record books, who copied the manuscripts, who tracked the years. It wasn't independent scholars. It was the church, the monasteries, the scribes cloistered in candlelight. If they were instructed to record time a certain way, they did. And if anyone questioned it, their writings didn't survive. Now consider the archaeological evidence. Very little material culture exists from those phantom years. Few buildings, few innovations, few verifiable artifacts. It's a strange lull, a dead zone in the timeline. We're told it's the result of the Dark Ages, a time when progress paused. But what if that pause never existed? What if the silence, it was a fabrication? Most mainstream historians dismiss the theory. They call it fringe, a distortion, a fantasy. But still, the gaps remain. Still, the inconsistencies linger. And still, the question echoes. What if some of our history isn't ancient at all, but medieval fiction? A timeline designed not to record the truth, but to shape power. Because time is not just a measurement, it's a weapon, and in the hands of those who control the past, it can be used to control the present and the future. They appear in lists, names, dates, decrees, pope after pope after pope, like beads on a rosary, carefully counted, deliberately placed, each one meant to tie the past to the present, to prove continuity, to prove legitimacy. But what if some of those beads are hollow? What if some of them were never there at all? Between the 8th and 10th centuries, the papal records become strangely opaque. The names are there. Pope Donus II, Pope Stephen III, Pope Valentine. They're said to have ruled, they're said to have prayed, written, blessed, and governed. But search outside of Vatican sources and they begin to vanish. No inscriptions, no letters, no eyewitness accounts. No outside confirmations from Byzantine, Frankish, or Islamic historians. Just silence. And when the only voice speaking is the one holding the pen, you start to question the ink. Historians have noted the oddities: duplicated names, contradictory reigns, popes whose terms were said to last years, and others just days, yet with no physical trace of their presence, no buildings commissioned, no relics buried, no acts recorded beyond the Vatican's own pages. What if these popes were more than forgotten? What if they were invented, created to patch holes in a fractured timeline, to fill the gaps left by war, plague, or simply ignorance? Because in a world where time itself was being rewritten, you'd need figures to anchor the illusion. You'd need guardians of faith to maintain the thread. Insert a name, backdate a papal bull, write a council into the record that never convened. And suddenly, history flows again, smooth, seamless, whole, but only on the surface. Some suspect this was part of a larger effort to extend the calendar, to legitimize newer rulers by tying them to an older church, to create the appearance of an unbroken apostolic chain. Because if the church had always been there, steady, unmoving, then its authority was unquestionable, its version of events undeniable. But if the line broke, even once, the illusion shattered. So maybe a few names were added, a few reigns adjusted, a few centuries smoothed into place. The question isn't whether this happened. The question is, would we even know if it did? Because the church was not just the spiritual heart of Europe, it was the archivist, the historian, the printer, and the preserver. And when one voice controls the scroll, truth becomes malleable, history becomes clay. So tonight, as you drift between thought and dream, consider this. Some of the most powerful men in history may never have drawn breath. They may exist only in ink, only in parchment, only in the pages that tell us what to believe. And if the keepers of time created the keepers of faith, what else might they have imagined into existence? Absence isn't always an accident. Sometimes it's an architecture, built deliberately, brick by invisible brick. Not everything missing from history was lost. Some of it was removed, with care, with purpose, with precision. Because to erase is to control, and the past is the foundation of everything: belief, loyalty, law, even identity. If you can shape what people think came before them, you shape what they believe is possible, what they believe is true, what they believe they must obey. That's the real power of history, not in what it tells you, but in what it keeps you from asking. So who would want to erase time, and why? Think of kings, of popes, of emperors and conquerors standing in the rubble of fallen empires. They needed to rule not just with armies, but with legitimacy, with narrative, and narrative needs continuity. It needs clean lines, a story that flows, without holes, without questions, without contradiction. But the real world is messy. Civilizations collapse, cultures clash, ideas rise, fall, and sometimes burn. So what do you do with those cracks in time? You fill them, you smooth them, you build bridges across forgotten centuries, even if those bridges are fiction. And once you've rewritten the past, you own the present and the future. Because people build their futures on what they think has already happened. They model their laws on sacred precedent. They trace their bloodlines to mythical ancestors. They swear allegiance to thrones that claim divine inheritance. But what if that inheritance is forged? What if those sacred precedents are inventions? What if the stories holding society together were crafted, like theatre sets behind velvet curtains? Then everything becomes fragile. Then the whole structure trembles, which is why the architects of absence worked in shadows. Not to create lies, but to erase alternatives. They didn't need to tell you a new story. They only needed to take the old ones away, the ones that challenged their power, the ones that remembered too much, the ones that reminded people of a world before control. That's why they erased, not out of cruelty, but necessity. To keep the illusion intact, to keep the world manageable, predictable, obedient. And so, century by century, page by page, the architecture of absence was built. It's still standing. You live inside it. We all do. And most will never notice. Because what was removed wasn't just knowledge. It was the awareness that something should be there. So you don't feel the emptiness, because you've never seen what filled it. And that is the genius of it all. The stars don't lie. They move in rhythm, in cycles so precise they make the gears of a clock seem crude. Long before telescopes, long before satellites, the sky was already keeping time, unbiased, unforgiving, untouched by politics or power. And that became a problem. Because while the heavens turned in silence, the church was setting dates, creating calendars, assigning years to events, and meaning to those years. Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. Time itself rebranded. But what happens when the sky and the scrolls disagree? Enter Galileo, a man who did not seek war, only truth. He looked through his telescope and saw moons orbiting Jupiter, phases of Venus, imperfections on the sun. The universe, once believed to be perfect, suddenly wasn't. But his greatest crime wasn't pointing a telescope toward the sky, it was pointing a question toward the past. Because the movement of the stars, their cycles and alignments didn't quite match the official timeline. There were discrepancies, lunar eclipses that didn't land where they should, planetary transits that contradicted recorded dates. And if the heavens were out of sync with history, then history might be wrong. Galileo wasn't alone. Astronomers before and after him noticed similar cracks, calendars misaligned, time bending in ways it shouldn't. But if the stars told one story and the church told another, which one would survive? The answer was simple, the one with power. Galileo was tried, silenced, his findings labelled heresy, not because they were false, but because they were dangerous. Dangerous to the timeline, to the architecture of sacred history. Because if the church's calendar was off, if celestial events proved gaps or worse, fabricated years, then the very foundation of Christian chronology would crack. Easter, the birth of Christ, the date of the apocalypse, all of it called into question. And if believers couldn't trust the timeline, what else might they stop trusting? So the sky was ignored, corrected, reinterpreted to fit the narrative. The Gregorian calendar was introduced in 1582. A correction, they said. 10 days dropped to realign time with the equinox. But what else was adjusted behind the scenes? What else was smoothed into silence? Because when truth floats above you, etched in stars, it's not easily erased, but it is easily denied. And so, for centuries, the sky remained overhead, unchanged, unyielding, a quiet rebellion against the written record. And still, most look down, at parchment, at doctrine, at history as told by men, not by light, not by time itself. Galileo saw the misalignment, and for that he was forced to recant, to kneel, to whisper that 2 + 2 no longer made 4, because when the stars contradict the scriptures, it is not the stars that must be silenced. It is the man who dares to read them aloud. History is written in layers, not always to preserve the truth, but to bury what came before it. We're told that after Rome fell, Europe sank into darkness, ignorance ruled, superstition flourished, progress halted. And then, suddenly, the Renaissance arrived, a burst of light, a miracle, an awakening. But what if that narrative isn't entirely honest? What if the so-called stagnation of the Middle Ages that was less of a failure and more of a fiction? The idea of a backward Europe served a purpose. It made the Renaissance look divine, like a flame reigniting after centuries of ash. But what if the fire had never gone out, only been hidden? Throughout the so-called Dark Ages, there were thinkers, builders, artists, engineers. They didn't vanish. They simply weren't celebrated. They worked in monasteries, in distant towns, under the eye of church censors, under the weight of fear. Their writings weren't copied widely, their inventions weren't glorified, and their ideas were often buried, not because they lacked brilliance, but because they didn't serve the prevailing narrative. And centuries later, when the Renaissance bloomed in Florence and Venice, the old story needed rewriting. The age before it needed to look empty, primitive, silent, because you can't call something a rebirth, if what came before it was never alive. So the invention of backwardness began, a sweeping act of historical stagecraft, declaring the Middle Ages barren, so that the Renaissance could shine brighter. Humanists like Petrarch scorned the centuries before them, not for what they lacked, but to make their own moment feel prophetic, a chosen generation, touched by genius, appointed to restore lost glory. But not all the glory was lost. Much of it had survived. In Eastern empires, in Islamic libraries, in hidden corners of Europe where minds still dared to think, and even within the church, despite its control, some knowledge persisted, encoded, obscured, but breathing. What changed during the Renaissance was not that ideas were suddenly born, but that permission was granted. Guarded doors began to open. Scrolls long hoarded were translated. Ancient thinkers reappeared as if by magic. But it wasn't magic, and it was access. And that access came with a story that placed the Renaissance at the center of everything, a golden age born from nothing, but in truth built on the backs of forgotten minds. So the lie was told. Europe had once been asleep, and now it had awakened. But maybe it had only been drugged, silenced, forced to whisper in shadows until the world was ready to listen again. Backwardness wasn't a condition, it was a costume, draped across history to make the new kings look wise and the old world seem worthless. And most believed it, because no one questions a miracle when it arrives wearing light. They stood in silence. Tall stone walls, cracked fountains, cathedrals with no names chiseled beneath the saints, Cities that had once echoed with music, laughter, invention, sank into stillness, and not for a moment, but for centuries. From the fall of Rome to the first sparks of the Renaissance, Europe's great cities seemed to sleep, not destroyed, not abandoned, just silent. No sculptures, no poems, no breakthroughs in medicine or engineering, only dust and prayers. Historians call it a cultural drought, a time when art was forgotten, when architecture stood still, when curiosity dimmed to an ember. But cities don't just forget how to dream, they don't forget how to build, to write, to celebrate beauty, unless they're told to, or forced to. What if that sleep wasn't natural? What if it was imposed? Take Paris, London, Cologne, Florence. All of them had Roman roots, all of them held knowledge, wealth and momentum. And yet, for hundreds of years, their voices faded. Only vague records remain. A bishop's name, a grain tax, a mention of plague. But where are the stories? Where are the inventions, the songs, the minds? They're not missing. They're absent. And absence, as we know, can be designed. Monasteries thrived during this time. But cities, they shrank. Not in size, but in spirit. The public squares fell quiet. Guilds dissolved. Schools closed. Taverns no longer buzzed with argument and poetry. Instead, cloisters grew, abbeys expanded, bell towers replaced libraries, and inside those walls knowledge didn't disappear, it was simply removed from public life, redirected, restricted. If you wanted to learn, you needed permission. If you wanted to teach, you needed approval, and the cities learned to obey. They were no longer the engines of culture, they were its ruins. A sculptor's hands went idle, a mathematician's chalk wore down, a playwright's quill dried up, and generation after generation, children were born into cities with no dreams of their own, only prayers, only fear, only obedience. So the silence stretched, until the silence itself became history. When the Renaissance finally arrived, it was hailed as a miracle, a rebirth of beauty, a rediscovery of reason. But no one asked, what kept it hidden for so long? Why had the cities waited in shadow? The answer was never written, because the silence didn't leave a signature, just a void, and in that void, entire centuries went unlived or unremembered. The sleeping cities still stand, their streets paved with forgetfulness, their walls whispering questions no one dares to answer, and beneath their stones the dreams that once bloomed there still wait, not lost, only locked, waiting for someone to ask why they ever slept at all. Once there were machines, wheels that turned without beasts, water that lifted itself, mechanisms that measured the stars, counted the days, moved with purpose, not mystery. In ancient times, invention was sacred, a celebration of mind over matter, of pattern over chaos. But as the centuries turned cold, those inventions vanished, and in their place came miracles. No longer did water rise through siphons, it was a blessing. No longer did illness follow cause and cure, it was punishment from above. No longer did the sky operate like a clock, it was now a canvas of divine will, and those who once explained the world were replaced by those who declared it unknowable. The shift was subtle. It didn't arrive with flames or chains, it arrived through reverence. Curiosity was rebranded as pride, experimentation became disobedience, and the question how was replaced by who willed it. The inventor gave way to the saint. Miracles were recorded where once stood mechanics, stories told of wells that filled themselves, of lamps that never ran dry, of voices that whispered prophecy into stone. But behind many of these miracles was design, physics, mechanism, lost in translation or buried on purpose. Because if a device performs a wonder, but the people do not understand how, it becomes magic, and magic belongs to the divine, not the workshop. So the tinker faded, the clockmaker disappeared, the philosopher was silenced, not because they were wrong, but because they disrupted the narrative. If machines could heal, what need was there for relics? If medicine could cure, why pray to bones in glass? And if man could harness nature, then what power remained for those in robes and crowns? So, invention became subversion, and those who dared to question the order were labelled threats, witches, heretics, blasphemers. They didn't burn every machine, they didn't destroy every scroll, they simply turned the people away from wonder and toward worship, not of knowledge, but of mystery. A miracle can't be replicated, a machine can, and that's the difference, that's the danger. And so the world stopped building, and started believing. It stopped solving, and started kneeling, and for 1,000 years miracles multiplied, while inventions disappeared. The gears of progress rusted in silence. The minds that once reached outward now looked only upward, and the tools of reason were traded for symbols. Faith has its place, but when it replaces understanding, when it erases inquiry, when it silences invention, it becomes something else. A shroud, a veil, a lock, and the key was never truly lost, only hidden, until the world dared, once again, to turn it. Stone remembers what paper forgets. Even when records are erased, when names vanish from scrolls, when ink fades into dust, the buildings remain, and some of them do not make sense. Across Europe, tucked into hillsides, clinging to cliffs, rising from forgotten foundations, stand structures that shouldn't exist. Not in the time they were supposedly built. Domes with perfect symmetry, spirals aligned to solstices, arches that require math no one was supposed to know. They call it Romanesque. They say it's primitive, a bridge between Rome and the Gothic age. But look closer. Some of these churches and towers dated to the 9th, 10th, even 11th century contain geometries too precise, too intricate, too refined for their era. They contain ratios the ancients revered, the golden mean, phi, sacred geometry embedded in stone, not for beauty, but for meaning. And then there are the alignments, buildings constructed with near celestial precision, windows that catch the rising sun on a single day of the year, passages that echo with sound only at certain frequencies, chambers that stay perfectly cool, without ventilation. How? How did a civilization, supposedly shrouded in ignorance, produce such marvels? Where did the knowledge come from? And perhaps more importantly, why was it never spoken of? No texts, no blueprints, no names, just stone, silently enduring. Some believe the builders carried old knowledge forward, survivors of Rome's collapse passing secrets through generations. Others suggest monastic orders preserved geometry in their hidden manuscripts, waiting for a time when the church would allow its use again. And some see something stranger, that these constructions are echoes, not of the past but of a history we were never told, a timeline buried, a people forgotten, because geometry isn't just math, it's language, it's power, it's intention embedded in space. To understand it is to understand order, energy, resonance. So when we find it in places that shouldn't have known it, we must ask, what else did they know? And why didn't they leave more behind? Or did they, and someone removed it? Stripped names from facades, destroyed the plans, erased the lineage of the builders, to make sure these places stood not as monuments to lost genius, but as anonymous shrines, strange, out of place, explained away. Yet there they are, silent contradictions, proof carved in limestone, whispers of a forgotten science hiding in plain sight. We're told they were built by craftsmen who couldn't read, who knew nothing of pi or pressure or celestial alignment. But maybe those men didn't need books. Maybe they remembered what the books no longer said. Maybe they were the last holders of something sacred, something precise, something feared. And once the stones were set, once the vaults closed and the bells rang, they vanished, and the geometry was left to speak without a voice. While Europe forgot, the East remembered. As cathedrals echoed with Latin chants few could understand, as streets narrowed under the weight of superstition, a different world was unfolding, just beyond the horizon. In Baghdad, libraries bloomed. The House of Wisdom rose in the 9th century, where scholars translated, preserved, and expanded the knowledge of Greece, Rome, Persia, and India. Mathematics thrived. Astronomy reached upward. Medicine became a science, not a prayer. They charted the stars while Europe outlawed the telescope. They refined algebra while European scholars debated whether zero was demonic. They studied optics while stained glass became the only visible colour in a grey world. In China, innovation was not feared. It was expected. During the Tang and Song dynasties, they printed books centuries before Gutenberg. They navigated with magnetic compasses and engineered clocks that marked the passage of time with astonishing precision. They created civil service exams, medical texts, and detailed maps of the known world. And in India, concepts of infinity, the decimal system, and surgical techniques had already taken root. They calculated planetary movements while Europe still debated whether the Earth moved at all. The East thrived, its memory intact, its curiosity unpunished, its ideas alive. So why was Europe the only one left in the dark? We're told it was the barbarian invasions, the fall of Rome, the fracture of the empire. But empires fall everywhere, and knowledge often survives them, unless it's made to disappear, unless a gate is built between the people and the truth and the key is kept by a few. Europe didn't lose knowledge. It was withheld, restricted, curated to serve not the people but the structure rising above them. While Eastern scholars debated philosophy in open forums, European thinkers risked death for challenging doctrine. While Arab scientists catalogued stars, Europe rebranded astronomy as astrology, and astrology as sin. It wasn't a difference in capability, it was a difference in permission. And that's what makes the silence of Europe so haunting. It wasn't universal, it was localized, controlled, enforced, and yet something strange happened, the East remembered. But eventually, Europe would be handed the credit. When the Renaissance arrived, many of its brightest ideas, the compass, paper, the concept of zero, flowed into Europe from the East. And yet history textbooks rarely mention the rivers they came from. Instead, Europe was declared reborn, enlightened, original, as if awakening from a long, deserved slumber. But was it a slumber? Or a suppression? And if the East never stopped dreaming, why did the West need to forget? Maybe because remembering would raise too many questions about who had the power, about who lost it, and about why some memories were never meant to return. There was a time when the stars guided everything. Sailors steered by them, farmers planted by them, kings consulted them before war, and priests watched them for omens. The sky was a library, each star a page, each orbit a sentence, each eclipse a warning or a promise. It was ancient, universal, sacred, but then it became dangerous. In medieval Europe, to gaze too long at the heavens was to invite suspicion, not of madness, but of heresy. Because astronomy, once a noble science, was slowly absorbed into something else. Astrology, mysticism, and then blasphemy. The stars, once seen as the gears of God's creation, were rebranded as temptations, as tricks, as forbidden knowledge, and those who studied them with too much detail were accused of seeking power not meant for man. It wasn't the stars themselves that posed a threat, it was what they revealed. Because celestial events, eclipses, transits, conjunctions, could be predicted, measured, mapped, understood. And with those measurements came questions about time, about creation, about the accuracy of sacred texts. The Julian calendar no longer aligned with the solstices. Holy days began to drift, prophecies tied to celestial movements failed to occur, and worst of all, some stars simply weren't where they were supposed to be. That kind of precision was problematic, because it placed authority in the sky, not in the church, and so the astronomers were told to stop, to look down, to pray, not measure, to wonder, not question. And those who refused, they paid. Giordano Bruno spoke of infinite stars and infinite worlds. He was burned. Copernicus waited until death to publish his theory that the Earth moved around the sun. Galileo, blinded, silenced, threatened, was forced to recant what his eyes had seen. The heavens became a battleground, not between science and faith, but between control and curiosity, because time itself was at stake. If the stars told a story different from the calendar, then the calendar could be wrong. And if the calendar was wrong, what else had been built on false time? The church needed the stars to stay quiet, to remain symbolic, not scientific, to inspire awe, not inquiry. And so, a silence fell over the sky. The tools of navigation and timekeeping were preserved in the East, while Europe learned to fear the heavens. To look up was no longer an act of wonder. It was defiance. The constellations still shone, the planets still moved, but their meanings were censored. It would take centuries for the stars to speak freely again, and even now their full story may remain hidden, not because they stopped shining, but because those in power once decided that light could be dangerous. The burning of books is loud, it draws crowds, it stirs outrage, it becomes a warning etched in smoke. But the real erasure is quieter. It happens in ink, in silence, in the decisions made by candlelight, deep within stone walls. During the so-called Dark Ages, books didn't vanish in flames. They vanished in choice, because only a few could write, even fewer could copy, and those who did so under the watchful eyes of the church. Monasteries became the factories of memory, scriptoriums, their beating hearts. Monks hunched over parchment, quills in hand, reproducing the world one line at a time. But not all books were welcome, not all thoughts deserved duplication. So a quiet sorting began. Some scrolls were chosen, others were left to decay, not because they were false, not because they were flawed, but because they did not fit. Writings by Epicurus, plays from ancient Athens, medical treatises from Alexandria, philosophies from Persia and India. Some were too secular, too scientific, too human. And the church, intent on controlling not just souls but stories, allowed only what served the faith. So what survived was not what was best, or most brilliant, but what was permitted. A monopoly of manuscripts. It wasn't censorship by fire, it was omission by design. And once something is no longer copied, it dies, not with a scream, but with a sigh. Think of how fragile a book is. One page lost, one translation corrupted, one monk distracted, entire lifetimes of thought vanished in the margin, and no one would know. Because the gatekeepers didn't just preserve texts, they defined what knowledge looked like, and they decided what the future would remember. Imagine a library with only certain shelves lit, everything else left in shadow. That was Europe for centuries. A library half remembered, a history half written, and the half that survived was edited, curated, framed in scripture and doctrine. This wasn't evil, it was control, subtle, relentless, effective. And for most people, those pages were never read anyway, because literacy had collapsed. What was written became sacred, untouchable, not to be questioned, only recited. And so the monopoly tightened, one inkpot at a time, one parchment at a time, until the memory of an entire civilization depended on the decisions of a handful of men writing in silence. And what they didn't write was as important as what they did. That's how history can be erased. Not with fire, not with war, but with quiet ink and deliberate forgetting. Not every gospel made it into the Bible. There were others, other voices, other memories. Some told of secret teachings, of visions, of wisdom passed in whispers, not thunder. These were the Apocrypha, the forbidden pages, the books that didn't make the cut. Not because they were proven false, but because they were inconvenient. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, names you know, but stories you've never been allowed to hear. Why? Because they painted a different picture of Christ, of divinity, of power. In these texts, Jesus does not always speak in parables. He speaks in riddles, in cosmic truths. He tells his followers that the kingdom is not in the sky, but within them. There is no hierarchy, no gate to pass through, no priest to bow before, just awareness, just awakening. To those who would later build a church, this was dangerous, revolutionary, uncontrollable. If people believed the divine lived within, why would they kneel to a throne of gold? Why confess to a man in robes? Why tithe, obey, or fear? So the pages were hidden, labelled heresy, buried in deserts, sealed in jars, lost for centuries. But they were never destroyed, because some knew that truth, even when silenced, echoes. The Gospel of Mary shows her not as a weeping figure, but as a leader, a disciple among disciples, closer to Jesus than any man. The Gospel of Judas reveals betrayal as destiny, not treachery, a necessary act to fulfill a greater plan. And the Gospel of Thomas? It dares to say this: split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift a stone, and you will find me. No altars, no temples, just presence, everywhere. These words were too free, too wild. They couldn't be controlled. So they were silenced. In the 4th century, at councils of men draped in purple and pride, a decision was made. This is scripture. That is not. This is truth. That is heresy. And with that decree, entire paths of understanding were sealed off. The canon was closed, and the forbidden pages were erased from the story billions would come to believe. But stories have a way of returning. In 1945, a farmer in Egypt uncovered a clay jar, inside a trove of ancient manuscripts. The Nag Hammadi texts, the forbidden pages, still intact, still waiting. They speak now more than ever, and they ask us to wonder, how many other truths were left out? How many other books were buried, not because they lied, but because they liberated? Because the greatest threat to power is a mind that knows it never needed permission to awaken. Preservation can look a lot like distortion if you're the one holding the pen. And in medieval Europe, that pen belonged to the church. Scrolls, scriptures, histories were copied with great care, line by line, ink over parchment. A holy act, they said. A service to truth, but truth has edges, and sometimes they were trimmed. It began with translation, from Greek to Latin, from Aramaic to Latin, from language of the people to language of the priesthood. And once a text passed through Latin, it became something else. Because Latin, sacred, rigid, untouchable, was not just a language, it was a filter, a veil drawn between reader and meaning. And through that veil, things could be added, removed, softened, sharpened, and no one would know, because few could read it, even fewer could question it. So a ritual was born, not of destruction, but of redirection. And ancient philosophers' warnings about tyranny became vague moral lessons. A scientific theory was reworded, its terms softened until they no longer threatened dogma. A historical account lost its names, its geography blurred, its impact dulled. The ink preserved the structure, but the spirit was changed. And once it was rewritten, that new version became the only version, the old question mark buried, deemed corrupt, labelled apocryphal. And so, generation by generation, Europe remembered what it was told, not what it once knew. This was not a mistake, it was a strategy, to control the past, without fire, without violence, just ink, just silence. Sometimes, a single word was all it took. The word demon, once meaning a spirit, a guide, became demon. The Greek logos, the rational principle of the cosmos, became simply word. Layer after layer of nuance, flattened. And yet, this rewriting was called preservation, because the texts were still there, still copied, still bound in leather and stored in vaults. But they were no longer what they had been, and so the ritual continued. Generation after generation of scribes, believing they were safeguarding divine knowledge, unwittingly reshaped the very foundation they were preserving. Not all did it with ill intent. Some truly believed they were clarifying, correcting, honouring. But even the purest hands can smudge the truth when the ink they use has been prepared by power. And when only one institution controls the narrative, yeah, but there's no one left to say that's not what it meant. So we inherited texts that survived the ages, but not untouched, not unaltered. 1,000 years of memory, written and rewritten in a language few could read, and fewer still could challenge. That is the ritual of erasure, not a fire, but a slow turning of the page until the original story is no longer there, and only the approved version remains. Maps are memory made visible. They don't just show space, they show time. They tell us what a civilization knew, what it believed, what it imagined, and what it remembered. But sometimes, maps remember too much. In 1513, a man named Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer, compiled a map, a fragment, just one section of a larger world. It was drawn on gazelle skin, annotated in Turkish. But what it showed shattered the boundaries of its age. The Piri Reis map depicted the coastlines of Africa, South America, and something else. The southern landmass, jagged, sweeping, iced, but clearly defined. Antarctica, 3 centuries before it was officially discovered, and not just a vague guess, but with remarkable accuracy. No satellite, no aerial view, no modern tools. So where did the data come from? Rice himself said it plainly. He compiled his map using older sources, very old. Some, he claimed, from the time of Alexander the Great, Greek maps, Phoenician charts, ancient references long forgotten. He wasn't inventing new geography, he was preserving ancient knowledge. But that raises a question that doesn't go away. How did people from the distant past know the contours of continents they supposedly never reached? Antarctica wasn't even visible beneath its thick ice shelf, not to the eye, not from sea level. And yet, the land beneath, its mountains, bays, and ridges, appear with uncanny clarity on that ancient skin. Were there explorers before Columbus, before Leif Erikson, before even the Vikings carved paths through the North Atlantic? Or was there a lost cartographic tradition, one erased by time, by conquest, by curation? The Piri Reis map isn't alone. Other maps from the Middle Ages show strange coastlines, land masses in the wrong places, or in the right places, far too early. The Orontius Phineas map, the Boache map, the Zeno map, all suggesting knowledge that didn't belong to the era that claimed it, all whispering a forgotten history, one of seafarers, navigators, cartographers who sailed farther than we're taught. And if their maps survived in fragments, how much else was lost? We're told these were guesses, coincidences, fanciful imaginings. But how do you guess mountain ranges beneath a mile of ice? How do you dream coastlines that match modern satellite images? The truth is unsettling, because it suggests that long before the age of discovery, someone had already discovered, and their work, their knowledge was inherited by those who came later. Not invented, not pioneered, passed down, through scrolls, through sailors' logs, through charts that survived the fires of time, but just barely. Most of that knowledge is gone, burned, buried, or locked behind doors labelled heresy, myth, mistake. Yet the maps remain, quiet relics, ink on skin, proof that the world was known, and then forgotten, or perhaps hidden. Beneath the marble corridors of the Vatican, past the gold and incense, past the whispering halls of saints and popes, there is a door, unmarked, guarded, silent. Behind it lies a vault, and inside that vault, history sleeps. Not the kind found in textbooks, not the kind recited from pulpits, but another kind entirely. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, once called the Secret Archive, and perhaps that name was more honest. For centuries, few even knew it existed. Fewer still were allowed inside. 85 kilometers of shelves, dozens of reading rooms, ancient scrolls, sealed letters, untranslated books, a world beneath the church, and within it, a shadow history. We know some of what's there. The trial records of Galileo, the excommunication of Martin Luther, the correspondence of kings and queens. But that's just the surface. The vault holds documents dating back over 12 centuries, and many have never been seen by anyone outside the Vatican. Not because they're damaged, not because they're missing, but because they're restricted. By policy, by choice. What could be so dangerous about parchment and ink? Some whisper of lost gospels, letters from early Christians that contradict the official story. Others speak of Roman records, scrolls carried from burning libraries, preserved by monks, never released. There are rumours of ancient maps, of astronomical tables that predate Galileo, of books on alchemy, medicine, even devices that have not been named aloud in centuries. But rumours are just that, and the Church guards its silence well. Requests for access must pass through layers of approval. You must name your text, cite your purpose, be watched, be patient. And even then, many shelves remain forbidden, sealed, not lost, but held. Why? Some say it's to protect the church's legacy, to prevent scandal, to preserve faith. Others believe it's to preserve control. Because knowledge once loosed cannot be put back. And in a world built on sacred authority, uncertainty is dangerous. So the vault remains, a library without a public, a memory without a voice. Imagine walking those halls, the air thick with centuries, the walls watching. A silence so deep you begin to hear the heartbeat of time itself. And somewhere in the dark, a shelf waits, holding a truth that could rewrite everything. Not with thunder, but with a whisper. One forgotten name, one letter never mailed, one gospel that sees the divine not above, but within. It's there, still breathing, still hidden, beneath the cross, beneath the power, beneath the story we've been told to remember, and the one we were never meant to know. They move silently, in robes of black, in sandals worn thin, not with swords, but with ink, with keys, with eyes that missed nothing. They were the watchers, guardians of memory, collectors of thought. To the world they appeared humble, men of prayer, men of solitude. But behind the monastery walls, beneath the candlelit chants and folded hands, a different kind of work was unfolding. Preservation, yes, but also selection, extraction, control. It began with the Benedictines, founded in the 6th century by Saint Benedict. Their motto was simple, ora et labora, pray and work. And they did. They prayed in cycles, and in between they wrote. They copied. They sifted through the wreckage of Rome and gathered what survived. Mathematics, philosophy, natural science, medicine, not to share but to contain. The Benedictines became the first great archivists of fallen knowledge. They built scriptoria in stone where monks bent over desks for hours, eyes aching, hands cramping, translating the world into silence. And then came the Jesuits, sharper, global, strategic. Formed in the 16th century, they arrived like shadows with purpose. Missionaries, yes, but also scholars, historians, explorers. They sailed to distant lands not just to convert, but to observe, to collect. In China they studied astronomy. In the Americas they recorded languages and rituals. In Africa they documented systems of healing that rivaled their own. And always they sent it back, to Rome, to the archive, to the vault. It was not theft. It was protection, they said. Preserving cultures. Preserving the truth. But preserved truth, when sealed away, is no longer truth. It is power. Both the Benedictines and the Jesuits understood this deeply. They didn't need to burn the heretic. They only needed to take his book, copy it, alter it, or lock it in a room no one could enter. To the public they were saints, men of God, living in poverty, vows of obedience. But in secret, they became the librarians of a world slowly forgetting itself, not by accident, but by design. Because to know is to choose, and they chose, which voices survived, which ideas were worth repeating, which truths could be folded into scripture, and which were too wild to tame. And as the centuries passed, as kingdoms rose and fell, the watchers remained, their robes unchanged, their rituals unbroken. They watched empires crumble, they watched revolutions burn, but their libraries endured, untouched, unseen, a shadow network stretching across time, and even now their hands are on the past. Their fingerprints on the stories were told, not out of malice, but out of certainty. That truth must be managed, and that knowledge is safest when it sleeps. It was as if the world remembered all at once. After centuries of silence, knowledge returned. The Renaissance arrived not like a spark, but like a flood. Suddenly ideas that had been gone for generations were everywhere. Blueprints, instruments, strange machines scribbled in new books but echoing something old. Gears, levers, lenses that bent light, and sketches of flight that no one should have been able to draw. Da Vinci, Brunelleschi, Copernicus. They weren't inventing in a vacuum, they were recovering, reviving, reassembling pieces of something that had already existed. But where had it all been? Why did so many brilliant minds emerge at once? With designs so precise, so advanced, you'd think they had been practicing in secret for centuries. Because maybe they had. The Renaissance was not a rebirth, it was a release. Ideas long preserved in silence were allowed to breathe again. And it wasn't random. Many of these discoveries emerged from places once under strict control. Florence, Venice, Paris, cities tied closely to the church but now craving independence. Suddenly the locks turned, old manuscripts were found, translated, printed, disseminated. But found where? Monastic vaults, private libraries, hidden drawers beneath cathedrals, textbooks that shouldn't have survived, instruments from lost laboratories. It was almost too clean, too complete, like the lights had been turned off, but never fully extinguished, as if someone had kept the flame alive behind the curtain, waiting, watching, until the time was right. Why not earlier? Why not during the famine, the plague, the wars that begged for innovation? Because the people weren't ready? Or because the powers weren't willing? The knowledge didn't evolve overnight, it resurfaced, as if unboxed, unsealed, and those who wielded it did so with precision, as though guided. The Vitruvian Man, the printing press, the flying machines. None of it feels accidental, it feels orchestrated, like blueprints passed down in whispers, held in vaults, released in stages, not to overwhelm, but to steer. What if the Renaissance wasn't an awakening, but a plan, not of genius, but of timing? And the knowledge that returned was not born anew, but preserved, like seeds beneath snow, waiting for the thaw. And now we marvel at the brilliance of that age. We call it a miracle, we call it progress. But what if it was something else, and what if it was proof that someone, somewhere had always known that light would be needed again, and so they kept it, safe, silent, and when the darkness had done its work, they let it shine. We call it the Renaissance, the rebirth, as if something dead had come alive again. But what if it was never dead? What if it had only been hidden, stored in silence, watched over by careful hands? The Renaissance dazzled. It gave the world Michelangelo's ceiling, Leonardo's sketches, Copernicus' stars. It resurrected Plato. It revived Euclid. It brought Aristotle back from the shadows. But the question no one asks is how? How did such a tidal wave of ancient brilliance surge forth so suddenly? Who kept it alive when the rest of the world forgot? Because if the Renaissance was a rediscovery, then someone, somewhere, had been holding the keys. Not finding. Holding. It wasn't as if dusty ruins were stumbled upon by curious minds. It wasn't a lucky excavation or divine inspiration. These texts, these ideas, surfaced through institutions, through channels, through permission. They were in monasteries, in libraries, in vaults, copied, guarded, translated only when it became acceptable or useful. So who decided it was time? Why release the light after centuries of calculated darkness? The Church, once the great suppressor of inquiry, now embraced it, at least in part. Patrons who once funded crusades now funded artists and scientists. Why the shift? Some say it was a reaction, that the Black Death, the rise of trade, the failures of old systems forced a change. Others believe something deeper, that the keepers of knowledge, those silent watchers, chose the moment, chose when to open the gates, chose who would carry the torch. They didn't release everything, only enough. A controlled stream, a measured revival. Enough to inspire wonder but not rebellion. Enough to spark curiosity but not chaos. And those who rose to fame during the Renaissance often had ties to noble houses, to religious orders, to networks that operated behind the veil of public history. It wasn't accidental, it was curated. The Renaissance wasn't a beginning, it was a reveal, a careful reveal, and perhaps a test to see what would be done with the light. Because when knowledge returns after centuries of silence, it does not come back innocent. It returns with questions, it returns with echoes, it returns with the memory of the lock that held it. And maybe, just maybe, those who unlocked it had their reasons. Not all noble, not all pure, but calculated, strategic, necessary, because timing is everything. And in history, what matters most is not just what you know, but when you're allowed to know it. The Renaissance wasn't new, it was old light finally permitted to shine. We like to think of history as forward motion, a steady climb, from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to enlightenment. But what if that motion was manipulated? What if time didn't flow naturally? What if it was steered, slowed, redirected, put on pause, not erased, just held back, like breath before a performance? Because when we look at the so-called Dark Ages, what we see isn't chaos, it's stasis, a world frozen in place, villages unchanged for centuries, art that repeats, architecture that forgets how to grow, not because people stopped thinking, but because thinking was no longer allowed to evolve. What if that was intentional? Imagine civilization as a clock, ticking, turning, measuring progress. Now imagine someone reaches inside and slows the gears, just enough, so it still moves, still ticks, but never strikes the hour. Centuries pass, but nothing truly advances, until the bell is finally allowed to ring, then suddenly invention, discovery, a rush of genius that feels spontaneous, but was waiting all along, waiting for permission. What if the pause wasn't failure, but design? What if time was managed like a stage production, with curtains drawn, actors positioned, scripts rewritten, until the audience was ready, and when the curtain finally lifted, it looked like progress, it felt like progress, but maybe it was only the next scene. Because when light returns after a long darkness, no one questions why it was taken in the first place. They celebrate the sunrise, they forget the night, and those who controlled the clock go unnoticed. We call the Renaissance a triumph, but perhaps it was a reveal, a deliberate shift in tempo, an acceleration after a long, unnatural stillness. And maybe that stillness served a purpose: to consolidate power, to eliminate alternate histories, to rewrite the narrative from the ground up. Not with lies, but with absence. So when progress resumed, it could be directed, shaped, claimed. Because when you delay the future, you gain the power to decide who brings it forth, and who gets to be remembered as its architect. It's not the timeline we should trust, it's the pauses, the empty spaces, the centuries that moved but left no footprint. That's where the truth waits, in the stillness, in the forgotten seconds between the ticks. Because history doesn't just unfold. Sometimes it's orchestrated. And the illusion of progress is the greatest magic of all. A trick of time so carefully done we never saw the hands turning the clock. History is not just what happened, it's what we're told happened, what we're shown, what we're allowed to remember, and much of that remembering takes place on a stage. A theatre, one with actors, with scripts, with lighting designed to draw your eyes to one moment and away from another. Think about the history you were taught, the clean lines, the tidy eras, ancient Greece, Rome, the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. Simple, digestible, convenient. But life doesn't work in clean lines. It stumbles, it overlaps, it contradicts itself. So who cleans it up? Who writes the script? The answer is not a single person, but a system. Textbooks are written by committees, funded by foundations, approved by boards, tailored to politics, to curriculum, to comfort. Because truth is often too messy to make it to the page. And the Dark Ages, they serve as the perfect curtain. A void between the grandeur of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. A quiet place to hide what doesn't fit. What was removed, what was reshaped. When something doesn't make sense in the timeline, it disappears into that shadow. A strange structure, Dark Ages. A lost invention, Dark Ages. A century with no progress, no art, no records, Dark Ages. It becomes a box, a drawer, a place to toss the pieces that don't serve the narrative. And then there's film. How often do you see the Middle Ages portrayed as dirty, grim, slow, a world of mud and superstition? Peasants grovelling, knights fighting over land they barely understand. That image isn't accidental, it's theatrical. It keeps the illusion alive, that there was nothing to see, that no one knew anything, that progress was on pause, waiting for the heroes of Florence and Paris to arrive. But the real story is more complex, more fragmented, more human. It's full of lost texts, suppressed inventions, silent revolutions that happened in monasteries, in workshops, in minds too dangerous to be remembered. Yet we don't hear those stories, because they were never part of the script, and history, like theatre, depends on the script. If it's not written, it doesn't exist. So we applaud the scenes were shown, we forget the ones that were cut, and we accept the story as it's handed to us. Not because we're ignorant, but because the performance is good, very good, convincing, polished, complete with costumes, heroes, villains, and dramatic arcs. But behind the curtain, there are pages that never made it into the book, maps that were never unrolled, voices that were never heard. And the true history? Still waiting in the wings. Some questions echo longer than others, not because no one knows the answer, but because no one was ever allowed to ask. And in the story of the Dark Ages, one question stands out, like a doorway with no handle. What was lost, and what was never allowed to be known? We speak of erasure as if it's an act, but sometimes it's not a single moment. It's a system, a structure built over centuries. One that doesn't destroy truth all at once, but smothers it slowly. You don't need fire to erase the past, you only need silence and time. 1,000 manuscripts left uncopied, a dozen questions left unasked, a few ideas labelled dangerous, and generation by generation the silence becomes normal, expected, invisible. It becomes the air inside the walls. And by the time someone notices, there's nothing left to notice. Because history isn't just about what's remembered, it's about what's remembered on purpose, and what's allowed to vanish quietly, without resistance. We imagine the past as a landscape, mountains of fact, rivers of story, a map we can study and trace. But what if it's more like a theatre set, built to look real, stable, complete, and just behind it a void, not of darkness, but of potential, of lives that were lived and forgotten, ideas that sparked and were snuffed out. Some say the Dark Ages were a time of sleep, but maybe it was not the people who slept. Maybe it was the memory of them that was sedated. Maybe they built machines we no longer understand. Maybe they wrote theories that were never read. Maybe they looked at the stars and saw patterns we now call impossible. And maybe someone decided those things didn't belong in the version of history we inherited, so they folded them away. In vaults, in languages no longer taught, in margins too faded to recover. And the silence became structural. It reinforced itself. Each generation assuming the last one asked the right questions and got the right answers. But what if the questions were never allowed? What if the answers were never given? Then what we call history is just what survived the silence, not the full story, just the version that fit. So the question lingers, not shouted, but whispered. What was lost, and what was never even seen? Not all absences are empty. Some are full of things we'll never know, and some were made to stay that way, intentionally, deliberately, quietly. And that's the question that history still refuses to answer. Not because it can't, but because somewhere along the line someone made sure it wouldn't. Some doors never open, not because they are locked, but because someone stands quietly in front of them, watching, not with swords or shouts, but with silence, with forms, with policies, with rules that shift just enough to keep you outside. And so we ask ourselves, are there still forces curating the past? Are there still eyes hidden behind institutions and titles deciding what we're allowed to remember? The answer is not mysterious. It's right there in plain sight. Archives that require credentials few can obtain. Vaults that need letters of recommendation just to approach. Collections that are technically open, but practically unreachable. Artifacts sealed in temperature-controlled drawers only handled with permission and only studied with approval. The deeper you go into history, the narrower the staircase becomes. You need the right language, the right funding, the right allegiance, and if you don't have those, you don't get in. Because history, at its core, is not just memory, it's authority. And those who control memory control the present. They decide what you revere, what you fear, what you forget. Why is it easier to visit a museum's gift shop than its basement archives? Why do the most revealing documents always seem to surface decades late? Redacted, fragmented, incomplete? Why are certain scrolls never translated? Why are entire libraries closed for restoration for decades at a time? There are always reasons. Security, conservation, bureaucracy. But the pattern is too consistent, too strategic. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, the British Museum's restricted collections, the sealed chambers beneath the Louvre, even university libraries with private rooms and classified papers. And the older the record, the harder it is to reach. You begin to see history not as a river but a dam, holding back, releasing only what is chosen, and upstream. You sense the presence of watchers, not shadowy cabals, not hooded figures in the dark, but administrators, academics, archivists trained not to deceive but to preserve through control. Their job is not to lie, it's to manage, to organize memory in a way that serves order, continuity, narrative, and within that narrative, truth becomes conditional. Because if you find a fragment that doesn't match the official version, what happens? Does it rewrite the chapter or disappear into a footnote? Most never see those fragments. Most don't even know they exist because the eyes are still watching, still filtering, still curating the past for the comfort of the present. And as long as they do, history will remain a story half told, half shown, a beautiful illusion lit just enough to keep you from asking what lies in the dark behind it. We've been taught that ignorance is a flaw, a byproduct of collapse, a symptom of war, of plague, of time slipping through careless fingers. But what if ignorance was designed? Not a failure, but a feature, not a consequence, but a strategy. Because ignorance isn't just the absence of knowledge, it's the presence of control. And the longer you look at the so-called dark ages, the more the darkness begins to feel deliberate, too consistent, too convenient, too quiet. 1,000 years where questions went unanswered, not because no one asked, but because someone made sure they couldn't. Knowledge wasn't lost, it was hidden, curated, filtered through robed hands and inked with caution. The flames of ancient libraries are dramatic, easy to blame. But the real damage was done with silence, with decisions made behind stone walls, with permission slips denied. And all the while, the world moved forward in ways unseen, secrets held, ideas postponed, histories rewritten, not for the sake of safety, but for the consolidation of power, because a people who don't remember can be taught to believe anything, and a civilization without its past can be shaped into something new, without resistance. Ignorance becomes useful. It becomes currency, a way to control not just thought, but imagination. You cannot dream what you have never seen. You cannot resist what you don't know is missing. So the gaps in history remain, not because they're unsolvable, but because they're protected. And we've built around them textbooks that skip, timelines that lie, narratives that keep us comfortable even as they keep us blind. And if someone dares to ask, what if this isn't the full story? they're met with laughter, dismissal, or worse, silence. The same silence that has shaped the past for centuries. It hums in our museums, whispers through our education, echoes in our faith, not with menace, but with certainty. Because if darkness is designed, then light must be permissioned, and truth becomes a matter of access. So we look back through the centuries and wonder, what were we not allowed to know? What inventions were never released? What voices were never heard? What stories were never told? Not because the world was too broken, but because someone decided we weren't meant to remember. And if we did, we might start asking the wrong questions, or the right ones. And that, more than anything, threatens the illusion. So maybe the Dark Ages never ended. Maybe they just changed shape, became digital, polished, efficient. And the darkness still exists, not outside of us, but around the places we're not allowed to see. And the only way out is to ask, again and again. What else have we been kept from knowing? There's a difference between forgetting and being made to forget. One is natural. The other is a design, a boundary placed around memory. A wall built so slowly, you never realize you're inside it. And that wall, for 1,000 years, was called history, but it wasn't. Not really. It was the edited version, the safe version, the version that kept the past just blurry enough to prevent the future from forming too clearly. Because if you remember what you once were, you begin to see what you could become again. And for those in control, that's the most dangerous thing of all. So they told you there was a darkness, a long, inevitable slumber, a time when no one thought, no one dreamed, no one built. And you believed them, because the proof was buried, the voices were silenced, the manuscripts were locked behind stone, but the truth never died. It waited, in ruins misnamed, in temples misdated, in maps misfiled and gospels misquoted. It whispered through architecture too perfect for its time, through stars that contradicted the calendar, through machines that shouldn't have existed, but somehow did. And still, the world moved on, worshipping a timeline sculpted by those who needed you to forget. Not everything, just enough. Enough to make you trust the story, enough to make you question yourself before you questioned the record. And maybe that's the deepest trick of all, not to erase, but to distort, to dim the light, just slightly, so it flickers like a memory instead of blinding like a truth. They never needed to hide the light. They only had to teach you to stop looking for it. And so we became the children of curated memory, walking through a museum where half the exhibits are covered in cloth, told to marvel, to admire, to never ask what's underneath. But even under the cloth the light remains, waiting, not buried, but placed, protected perhaps, or hidden, or saved, for someone willing to see without permission. Because maybe humanity never truly forgot. Maybe it remembered in dreams, in symbols, in questions that never stopped echoing, even when the answers disappeared. Maybe the light was never lost, just denied, and all this time we were not walking in darkness, but under a dimmed sky, one built to make us smaller, quieter, easier to guide. But you're here now, asking, wondering, tracing the cracks in the story you were given, and that alone is enough to let the light through. Because the greatest secret wasn't hidden in books or vaults or ancient ruins. It was hidden in the question they never wanted you to ask. What if the world is older, brighter, and far more extraordinary than they ever let you see? And what if the memory you're searching for was always yours, just waiting to return? If you've made it this far, then maybe a part of you already knew, maybe you've always felt it, that something was missing, that history didn't quite line up, that the silence between the centuries wasn't empty, but filled with answers we were never meant to find. You're not alone. There are others who feel that strange pull, who stare at old stones, at ancient stars, and wonder what the world once was, and could be again. This journey isn't just about looking back, it's about reclaiming what was taken, remembering what was buried, and most of all, asking the questions that were never allowed. So if this stirred something in you, even a whisper, then don't let it fade. Subscribe. Because here, we go deeper, we turn over the stones, we walk through the forgotten, we listen to the echoes and follow them wherever they lead. Like this video, if it made you pause, if it made you feel that strange electricity of truth hiding beneath the surface. Leave a comment. Tell us what part you felt in your bones, what chapter left you in silence, what question you're still holding as the screen begins to dim. And most of all, share this with someone else who's been searching, someone who's felt that same quiet dissonance, that suspicion that history might be a performance, and the real story is still waiting behind the curtain. Let's build a community not of followers, but of rememberers, of question askers, of light seekers, of those who no longer accept the world as it's been explained, but crave the version that was never shown. Because if enough of us start to see the light they hid, the darkness won't hold. Not this time. So stay curious, stay awake, and whatever you do, don't stop asking what they never wanted you to remember. We're just getting started.